Next to me, I have the current generation Lexus GX460, and it is no stranger to moderate and even black diamond trails. It's filthy dirty, and it's not lifted. And today, we're going to talk about why this vehicle hasn't been lifted. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Before we get started, disclaimer. This is not at all about whether you should lift your vehicle or not. That's going to be a personal choice. So this is in no way any judgment on should you lift, should you not lift. Instead, we're going to go over the philosophy of why this vehicle is not lifted. In other words, why did we choose not to lift this Lexus GX460, which, as you can see, has many miles off-road. In fact, it lives off-road and has indeed gone up plenty of moderate trails and lots of black diamond trails as well. And it's not lifted at all. So before we can get into why this vehicle's not lifted, let's just talk about the three main camps when it comes to lifting vehicles like these. And when I say vehicles like these, I mean any off-road vehicle or off-road intended vehicle. But let's specifically talk about the Lexus GX460 and, say, Toyota 4Runner. Those type of vehicles. Why is it not lifted? Well, there's three classes, and generally, or I should say camps of people when it comes to lifting. And these camps are generally don't lift it because Toyota engineers know what they're doing. They already made it perfect or perfect enough. Okay. The second camp is, well, I like the looks of things, so I just want to change the look, so purely aesthetic. And the third camp is somewhat controversial and somewhat psychological, and I think that's what we're going to start off with, this third camp. We'll work our way back. The great 20th century psychoanalyst Edward Bernays was the nephew of the great psychologist Sigmund Freud. Edward Bernays was tasked with a problem by a client who happened to be the maker of the Betty Crocker cake mix. In essence, Betty Crocker came to him and they said, we have this ready-made cake mix. All you got to do is add water. It was popular in World War II. We gave it to our soldiers, and they made great cakes out of it. All you had to do was add water. But we put it on shelves now a couple months ago, and it's simply not selling. Why? How do we get this just add water cake mix to sell? Edward Bernays looked at the problem and came up with a simple answer. And that was simply put on the instructions of this cake mix to simply add an egg, a regular chicken egg yolk, into the mix, mix it up, and then that's it. So Betty Crocker changed the labeling on the package, and sales of this instant cake mix skyrocketed. The solution, as Edward Bernays said, was to just add an egg. And this is going to tie into what I'm talking about with this third psychological group when it comes to lifting a vehicle. And that is, some people, as Edward Bernays found, feel that it's necessary to add something to something that was made by somebody else. In other words, Edward Bernays said to Betty Crocker, the women don't feel that they have it's hard to say this word, contributed enough to the cake mix when they just add water. The women want to feel like they contributed more than just water to making something. Perhaps they feel guilt over just adding water. Perhaps they don't feel that they contributed enough. Perhaps some combination of two. Regardless, they need to be more involved in the instant cake mixing process. That was the psychology behind adding an egg. When it comes to lifting a vehicle, some people feel that they just need to add something. And this can go into modifications in general. They're not adding modifications for any practical or aesthetic purpose at all. In other words, not for utility and not for looks. They just want to feel as if they're building a vehicle, and they want to lift it, add parts to it, just in order they can say that they, quote, added their metaphorical egg to the product here, and that they built it themselves. They want to feel that they were involved building it. It's psychological. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and again, I'm not passing judgment, but that is that third camp. A group of people that want to feel that they contributed more to the building of the vehicle than they actually did. This vehicle, a Lexus GX460, was built in Japan. It was built by Japanese men and women. It was engineered by Japanese men and women. That's who built this. Not me, them. That's okay with some people, but it's not with other people. And they want to feel that they built the vehicle too. And that third group will often add modifications, lift included, for psychological benefits. Again, not passing judgment, we're just going over the three main types of vehicle lifters. If you're in that third group, that's fine. We're just discussing it, and we're just putting it out in the open, and I can certainly understand the psychological want behind that. You know, everybody wants to have ownership or control over the things they possess, and some may not be okay with it being somebody else's product, and they want to feel that they had more to do with it than not. I get it. That's not to say I do it, but I get those who do, but that is that third camp. So let's move on to the second camp, which is aesthetics. People like to lift their vehicles simply for the look. And again, that's a subjective thing. Do you like the way it looks? If you like the way it looks, then you're happy, and you should lift your vehicle because it looks good and that makes you feel happy. So do it. Again, that's up to the individual and their opinion of how the car looks and how they feel about the car looking lifted. So that's the second camp, aesthetics. You like the way it looks. Now getting to camp number one, which is the camp I'm in personally, that would be the Toyota did a good job, leave it the way it is. And that also ties into the utility of the vehicle as well. In other words, I believe, and I think most people believe, including the engineers of this vehicle, that they've done a tremendously fantastic job getting this thing to do tremendously crazy things in stock configuration. I feel that the stock setup is well engineered for reasonable on and off-roading. Now, utility, what you're going to get out of it. If for some reason you're doing extreme rock climbing or extreme off-roading, then a vehicle lift would add utility. And it wouldn't be just looks, and it wouldn't be just Toyota did a great job. You'd be adding a level of utility. But I think in the real world, for the off-roading that most people are going to do, and even beyond that, which this car has done, the stock configuration is awesome. Now, for me to say it's superior is subjective, so take from that what you will, but I think it is. What's my reasoning behind that? Because it's very well balanced, and when you start to lift a vehicle, it becomes a trade-off. By lifting, you give up something here. The more you lift, the more you give up something from the stock configuration. And what you're giving up is often something that you probably didn't think was even there, if that makes any sense. And you'll feel it the moment you lift, or in some cases, if we're talking about different cars, lower your vehicle. You'll immediately find out what you just sacrificed in order to get that lift. And for this vehicle in particular, it handles great on-road. So the KDSS suspension keeps it flat. There's no brake nosedive. It handles very car-like for being a big fat truck. However, off-road, the vehicle is already lifted. It's already lifted off the ground. It's an SUV. It's based on the Toyota 4Runner and the Lexus Land Cruiser Prado, all in the same family there. And it's already lifted right out of the box. And the geometry is set up in such a way and tested, most importantly, by engineers at Toyota, and independent testers have tested this thing on and off road to maximize reasonable on-road expectations and reasonable off-road expectations, and combine the two into what they believe is the sweet spot. Like the Three Little Bears story, it's the middle ground. Could you make it one way better, or in this direction or this direction by lifting it? Yes, you could, but at what cost? The sweet spot, that perfectly sweet center, is what I believe these stock height configurations offer the driver. And that sweet spot is not this thin line. That's what I'd like to say, is that it's a very nice sweet spot. You're getting, for what it is, great on-road and great off-road in nearly all conditions except the absolute extremities. So unless you plan on doing extreme off-roading in your Lexus GX460, you can do a whole lot in the stock configuration. And let's talk about that stock configuration, because I think it should be pointed out, or at least underlined and highlighted, that this stock configuration is not some Mickey Mouse setup that just fell out of a parts bin and Toyota just slapped together. You have Tokiko shocks on here, twin tube. Tokiko shocks, very reputable Japanese shock manufacturer. And we have beaten the heck out of these stock shocks, and we have not a drop of hydraulic oil. Under most circumstances, these shocks should be leaking and have blown their seals on oil by now, but they haven't. Tokiko is a very good brand. Keep in mind, if you do decide your lift to do a lift, that you're going to be taking off those Tokikos, and you're not going to be replacing them with a Tokiko lift kit. You're going to essentially be replacing it with a Chinese brand, no name, relabeled China shock. So here's an example of a typical aftermarket shock. This one's not for the GX, but it's the same idea. You have a fancy color, fancy mounts, and it's made in China. You're going to get no name on this, and it doesn't matter what fancy color they paint it or what brand sticker. It's going to come from a no-name Chinese factory, and this might be okay on your 89 Chevy Cavalier, but you have to question, do you want to put this on or something like this, do you want to put something like this on a very well-made Japanese car that comes with Tokiko shocks? So this is your Chinese shock, and that's an aftermarket shock. That's what goes on when you do a lift kit. They're all made in China, no matter what brand is stamped on them. You're going to be putting a Chinese shock in place of your Japanese shock. What's that going to do in terms of overall reliability and the overall offerings of this vehicle as a whole? So again, you're going to be sacrificing something. But getting back to the stock configuration, you have Tokiko shocks, you have Japanese-made springs, you have high-quality components, you have high-quality control arms, sway bars, the KDSS system, the whole works. Even if you have the airbag set up, it's high quality. So objectively, just the build quality alone, especially if you're concerned with things like durability, ruggedness, reliability, and that's very important out here where we have to rely on these off-road vehicles. And that's also very important in the markets this thing is sold in which is, third world, Australia, these rough and tumble type places where they have to last. You're going to get the most durability out of your stock setup. It's hard to argue that your Chinese aftermarket shock, no matter what color of neon it's painted, it's hard to argue that that shock made in China is going to last as long as a Japanese-made shock. The second consideration in the stock setup is to do with the geometry. And that is the relationship between the car's body, frame, and all the suspension components working together. This is something that has been engineered. Again, not an afterthought, but meticulously engineered by Japanese Toyota and Lexus engineers to give the most performance and the most reliability. It's often said that, hey, just add a little bit of lift and it's going to make a huge improvement. And then the argument comes into question, well, if it only takes an inch, 2-inch lift to make this into a super duper truck, why didn't Toyota engineers do that? Why not just add a little bit more lift and just make it super better? Why not put the aftermarket stuff on it and it's that much more awesome? The answer is simply, it doesn't. If you are in the camp that wants great on-road performance within reason and great off-road performance within reason. Again, if you're going to do something extreme, or you want the looks, or you just want to feel like you're controlling that car, that Betty Crocker and the egg, then that wouldn't apply to you. You'd want to go ahead and do your lift, and there's no judgment on that. But if you are in the camp that wants to keep the stock setup and you're wondering, is this going to take me far? Do I need to be lifted? In other words, is it a requirement to have this car lifted on big tires in order to do basic off-roading or even more difficult off-roading? The answer is simply no. These things are all around the world as Land Cruiser Prados in their stock configuration, doing all sorts of crazy things. And that alone is evidence that the stock configuration is good. In order to fault the stock configuration, we have to find areas where it is indeed faulted. And lifting would give you more ground clearance so you could straddle over rocks. That is an improvement, but like we said earlier, at what cost? Okay? What comes to mind is when we took our GX to Off-Road Trail 2N17X, and we went on this kind of steep, very steep, rutted, and it was off camber at an angle, and we did this kind of ridiculous uphill and angle to the driver's side line, and that is something we would never attempt on a lifted vehicle, because the trade-off if the vehicle was lifted is you'd have less suspension travel in that one direction, and in the nutshell, the vehicle would be more apt to tip over. In other words, be more tippy, and that's an example of a trade-off of lifting versus what am I going to give up in the real world on the stock configuration. So your tippiness is going to come into play, and it's going to have to be a learning curve if you do decide to lift your vehicle. You're going to have to kind of relearn from the stock configuration. But mathematically speaking, the vehicle in stock configuration is in its most harmonious, capable balance for what it is. I would argue that instead of lifting your vehicle, if you're thinking about doing moderate to difficult off-roading, instead of thinking about lifting it, try to find out first what you can do in stock configuration. You'll be surprised with some basic off-roading technique, some practice, some experience and some basic know-how, I think you're going to be surprised at everything this can do. So one last thing I just really want to press across, and that is, I'm in no way passing judgment on how anybody wishes to modify their vehicle. I have certainly, without a doubt, in the past, modified past vehicles, whether lifting or lowering, in the light of Edward Bernays, in that I felt that I wanted to add my egg to the cake mix. I wanted to add a part of me to the overall vehicle, and that was my sole purpose for modifying that particular vehicle, if I was to be completely honest with myself. So if you want to modify for that, I've been there, I've done it, and in no way passing judgment, because I've done it. I've also in the past modified purely for looks. Everybody can relate to that. You think something's going to look better, been there, done that, that's all good. I've done it. All I'm saying, for this particular vehicle, for this Lexus GX460, we've chosen to go the route of keeping it mostly stock, or as stock as possible when it comes to the suspension, simply because I believe that Toyota and Lexus engineers have already done a phenomenal job right out of the box. And this comes from actually testing it, taking it out on the trails, getting out there and seeing what it can and can't do. And I believe that Toyota engineers, with the stock setup, the stock suspension height, have reached that perfect sweet spot. Now we do have modifications on this, such as the bumper, the rock sliders, and some aftermarket BFG KO2 tires. But again, it's in the light of modifications that are more function over form. And that's just our choice. So whatever it is you're going to do, go out there, do it, mod it however you like, and enjoy it. This is just our take on this vehicle. If you found this video helpful, please remember to like and subscribe. Thank you, and have a great day.